Irony is a consistent storytelling tool because it creates good drama and interesting scenarios. One trope that takes full advantage of that is the immortal who wants to die. Not only does it create an unusual motivation, it also makes the immortal's goal nearly unattainable. And Zeref from Fairy Tail is my favorite example of this trope. Due in large because at its core, Fairy Tail is not only a story about friendship and found family, but also the sanctity of life, grief, and fear of the future. Zeref's curse of immortal life and his inability to control the death magic that came with it plays into these ideas in all sorts of interesting ways. In addition, most of the story arcs indirectly characterize Zeref through his inventions that he created throughout the ages, each one reflecting how he felt at that point in time. But before we talk about the man himself, let's begin with how he impacted the story before appearing, because it's both significant and hilarious. Zeref is first mentioned in chapter 12 of the story, when a group of wizards called Eisenwald tried to kill a large group of people with Lullaby, a flute-possessing death magic that was supposedly created by Zeref. And likewise, we keep hearing about all these evil inventions he made. Demons, weapons of mass destruction, etc. And because of this, Zeref's reputation is one of a dark messiah, an evil wizard obsessed with understanding the depths of magic and creating weapons for the sake of power. His followers spread death and chaos in his name, usually using the very tools he left behind. This climaxes with the main villain of Tenro Island, Hades, who's a big Zeref fanboy. He's lost all faith in the future of magic and wants to go back to its roots. The roots being Zeref. He believes if Zeref, the origin of magic, is a god of death, black, and evil, then he too would become all of those things. He teaches all of his underlings old magic in an attempt to get closer to Zeref. But despite their devotion, none of the members of Zeref's cults have actually met him, including Hades. And when he finally did, he wasn't the idol he believed him to be. If anything, Hades matches Zeref's reputation better than Zeref himself, an old mage prolonging his life with forbidden spells and willingly leaving destruction in his wake. Our first glimpse of the Black Mage isn't a tyrant hell-bent on destroying the world. It's a sad, lonely man looking for his place to die. Zeref was cursed with immortality for trying to revive the dead, and this curse would kill all he cherished around him, known as Ankrism's curse, or the curse of contradiction. And hold on to that word contradiction, because it'll only get more important as the story goes on. Devoid of meaning and companionship, life as a drifting plague was torture. So Zeref invented these tools and these dark magics to try and aid his own suicide. You can look at all the tools he left behind and imagine why Zeref would have made them. The flute lullaby would be Zeref's most direct attempt, trying to use death magic on himself. There's many inventions and we'll talk about them later, but long story short, Zeref was furious to see his attempts to end his own life used to end the lives of others. Initially, Zeref loved life. He loved it so much he stopped at nothing to bring his baby brother back to life, resulting in his first creation, the R system, or as it's come to be known as, the Tower of Heaven. He made the blueprints before he became immortal and far before he grew to hate life. It's a reflection of the heretical yet earnest love for life he initially had as a young man, but it would be twisted by his followers. They'd interpret it as Zeref's selfish attempts to become immortal. It would bring Zeref's second coming, not knowing he never actually died in the first place. And the R system is the centerpiece of a story arc all about sacrifice and the sanctity of life, made evident by the Council's talk and how to deal with it, and Urza's story arc. Because he refused to accept the natural course, he would be forced to carry death magic with him by God. It would attack all life he cherished, meaning that in order to save the lives around him, he had to forget how valuable life was. And now he's left swinging like a pendulum, forgetting and remembering and forgetting again the value of life. I said his build-up was hilarious because if you ignore the tragedy of it, he shows up, calls his followers dorks for trying to kill people, and says they should have been trying to kill him all along. Zeref still loves life in a way, and yet he won't stop creating instruments of death in an attempt to end his own. Most of his followers never understood him, and that irony makes for a good tragedy and a good comedy. Tenro Island ends with the main cast getting stuck in a bubble for 7 years, only to emerge into a less than ideal time. Their guild is still there, but its reputation has gone down the trash, and most interestingly, Lucy's father has passed away. He was an antagonist and a complete jerk early in the story, but he had shown signs of changing and Lucy's possibility of reconnecting with her father was cut off. It's scary how much the world can change in 7 years. And 7 years later, a villain would travel back in time in an attempt to change and control his own future. All because he too lost a loved one. The Eclipse Gate was Zeref's second attempt to save his brother. He would use time magic to go back in time and stop everything before it went wrong. Unfortunately, the gate can't go back any further than its own construction, so it was another dud. But it represents Zeref's refusal to move on. And the Grand Magic Games is in part about learning to live with the past and to make the most of what you have. The next story arc, Tardos, is focused on grief, particularly on grieving for parental figures. Natsu's quest for his father Dragneel is just the slow and sad realization that he lost his dad without even knowing it. They were reunited, but that moment was meant to be fleeting, along with the rest of the Dragon Slayers and their dragon parents. Lucy has to part with her judgy aunt in order to save the guild. Minerva cuts off ties with her abusive father in order to make new bonds in her guild. And my favorite example is Gray having to see his father die a second time. And before we move on, I just want to marvel at how many layers of irony are in this scene where Silver dies. Here's a short list of what I counted. It's a pretty great part of the story. Overall, the antagonists in Tardos are just demons who hate humans. But remembering that Zeref's creations reflect his character, the demons tell us quite a bit. He made the demons to aid in his own suicide, yes, like many of his other creations. But the demons are also the only ones staunchly malicious towards humans. They think humans are foolish, less than animals, prey, or toys. And Zeref believed all of these things at some point, and still does to some extent. He's seen the cycle of war and death perpetuate even without his involvement. It dulled his sense of life's worth. Tardos is the only arc in the series with a high body count, not just for named characters and the demons themselves, but also for innocent bystanders. It's a bit jarring given Fairy Tail's tone, but it's done to highlight how worthless life is to the demons. Taking a look at the members of Tardos, one by one we can glean some interesting details. Keys is a necromancer which plays with the idea of life and death very blatantly. Go back to the list for more specifics. Kyoka can embody not only Zeref seeing humans as playthings for his amusement or his experiments, but also his guilt. Kyoka is a dominatrix whose most noble power is increasing one's pain. At some point, Zeref imagined a painful death for himself, probably to atone for the lives he took. Franmalth measures the worth of souls through money and power. We see later Zeref gets around his curse by viewing his own empire like a board game. He still sees the value in life, but he forces himself to view it in only practical terms. This pawn is worth 1 unit of strength, while this one is worth 20, etc. Some of the demons mimic Zeref's behavior, like Tempester has memory loss every time he's reborn, mirroring Zeref and his occasional lapse of memory through the centuries. Jackal can't help but destroy everything he touches, but unlike Zeref, he takes joy in that destruction. And most of the demons come with a self-destruct button, because even their own lives hardly mean anything to them, especially because they can just reincarnate back at the lab. Life and death have little meaning to them because they don't have the reference point that humans do, similar to how Zeref slowly lost his after being cursed. The leader of Tardos is kind of just a smug ass named Mardgeir, and he likely represents Zeref's ego. Zeref and Mardgeir see themselves as far above humans, and yet they can't help but both be irritated and interested in them, because both Tardos and Zeref are far more like humans than they'd like to admit. This is highlighted most by both of their desires to suppress emotions for the sake of their goal. With only the final arc left, now is a good time to talk about Mavis. Mavis grew up alone on an island with only an imaginary friend to keep her company. She, at even a young age, understood solitude, and in their first meeting, she gives Zeref some solace in her illusions. And after some shenanigans years later, Mavis too would fall under the same curse as Zeref. Being forced into solitude after finally finding her own family devastated her. But Zeref and Mavis thought they could walk side by side forever. Both being immortal meant that the curse couldn't kill them, no matter how much they cherished one another. A contradiction to defeat the contradiction. Or at least that's what they hoped. Zeref's solitude lasted far longer than Mavis's, and so his long-sought relief ensured he cherished Mavis far more in that moment. And that meant his curse was stronger. Not strong enough to kill Mavis, but strong enough to put her to sleep indefinitely. And with that, Zeref lost all hope in genuine human connection. The only one he had left was his revived brother, END. His final hope for death. His strongest demon. Rather than spending his time trying to wake Mavis up, which was possible, he looked towards a fiery death at Natsu's hands. It's interesting that when magic is formally explained, it's said to come from emotions like faith, love, or a desire for freedom. And curse energy, the power that demons use, would specifically draw from negative emotions. Zeref began magic the same way his life began, in peaceful positivity. But over time, his unnatural life made it all sink into sadness, anger, and apathy. And anger was the specific emotion he tried to pull out of Natsu. Without a cause or connections to live for, all that was left was a future to fight against. The one thing Zeref fears most is Acnologia, an immortal like him but far more powerful and hell-bent on the destruction of all things. If Zeref was the root of magic, then Acnologia was the end of everything, the Alpha and the Omega. If Acnologia destroyed the world, all that would be left is him, Zeref, and a wasteland. With a doomed future ahead, all he could think to do is to take more radical measures to return to the past. Zeref wouldn't be the final antagonist because it's fitting to see the cast overcome the future Zeref feared so much. But the final arc would still focus on him far more than Acnologia. Throughout every arc and every fight therein, one of the core ideas in Fairy Tail is that emotion is intrinsically tied to magic power. You care about your friends a bunch and you become strong and all that jazz. But the final arc presents Zeref as someone who disassociates with his emotions to an extreme degree. You can see in a bunch of his dialogue how he contradicts himself in the same scene, and other characters notice. He's been separating himself from his emotions for so long that he's unsure of his own motivations. Does he enjoy playing his board game on Alvarez, or is he disgusted by war and violence? Does he want E&D to kill him, or does he want to defeat Natsu and complete his master plan? Well, it's both, I guess. He doesn't seem to prefer one over the other. The curse of contradiction has left him so flippant. His emotions are extreme, but not focused on one place for too long. And among Zeref's closest underlings, the Spriggan 12, the two largest motifs among them is disassociating with emotion and manipulating emotions. And they become more interesting when you remember that Zeref personally mentored and even created some of them. Agil is our introduction to the group and the first to be defeated, and because of that he's the simplest. He establishes that the Spriggans see themselves as more than human. They aren't like normal people, therefore emotions and such can hardly apply to them. And sometimes it's true. Wall is a literal machine. He has no emotions to speak of. Particularly his language is important. Wall says that humans are picky with their words, and Zeref is intent on referring to Mavis's body as an it or a magic in the final arc. A clear contrast to where Lucy almost does the same in her journal entry only to correct herself. Bloodman is another demon made by Zeref, meaning he's likely devoid of empathy. He's the combination of all the malicious violent magic Zeref created. But some of them fail to maintain that stoic disassociation. Because of his curse, Zeref couldn't show any love for his son August. And in an attempt to try and earn his father's respect, August would master as much magic as humanly possible. Any of all magic-based attacks would be useless against him, for he understood it all and understood even more. But his fatal weakness is physical defense. This physical weakness of his represents the lack of love he felt. He's never been hugged or touched by his father, and not anyone else as far as we know. His opponent Gildarts wasn't just an expert at destruction magic, he was also a physical beast. Because he's an affectionate father figure in Fairy Tail. Everyone refers to him lovingly as the old man. He pampers Kana whenever he can, and roughhouses with Natsu all the time. He's not afraid to show love physically, in more ways than just one. The only time August is injured throughout the arc is by a stab from one of his allies and Gildarts' punches. He's literally weakest when people get close because no one has ever been close to him before. Despite Gildarts' insistence that parental love is natural and universal, across the battlefield, another Spriggan would ruthlessly fight their own daughter. One of Irene's first interactions with Zeref is telling him that he'll have to discard his emotions and even his love for Mavis to defeat Acnologia. And she intends to do the same with her daughter. She aspires to be like Acnologia or Zeref, to fully embrace her curse and become more powerful for it. But she would fail time and time again to become a true monster. She gave Urza away because she couldn't trust herself not to steal her own daughter's body, thinking she had to do it then and there because she was unable to trust she wouldn't change her mind later. And even after years later, she'd fail to take Urza's body again. She was simply too happy to find her daughter not just alive and well, but surrounded by a new family. She couldn't throw away her baby girl's life or her emotions entirely. And to act like you can is considered folly in this story. But few characters would go further for that cause than Invel. Invel idolizes Zeref and his boundless knowledge, believing him perfect with only two flaws, his bond with Mavis and Natsu. And despite Zeref's wishes to see Mavis treated with respect and to give Natsu one last chance to kill him, Invel would go behind Zeref's back to eliminate those bonds. Invel's change can literally erase someone's sense of self and control their actions. And he attempts to do this with Zeref metaphorically. His plans involve manipulating people's emotions for the cause of erasing his king's emotions. And his plan goes off the rails when he underestimates two people's bonds and they sever his chains. Nineheart and Lacard are more direct examples. Nineheart uses one's past to dig up trauma and regrets, while Lacard can target visceral desires, hunger, tiredness, and sex drive. His power to instantly defeat anyone who isn't chaste is hilarious because it confirms who in the cast are virgins, but more interestingly, it affects even Zeref and Irene. Despite all their big talk about no longer being human, they experience the same wants and needs as everyone else. It's kind of ironic that most of the Spriggans see themselves as gods, and even Zeref himself does after obtaining Fairy Heart. And yet a real capital G god was who cursed Zeref to begin with. If anyone should understand the fear of God, it's Zeref and his followers. It's not as if having conflicting feelings or multiple motivations isn't normal. In fact, Natsu has a dichotomy of his own. He represents both the accepting warm love of his guild as well as the passionate burning rage that destroys all those that threaten it. And Natsu is given a pretty clear choice between which of these motivations will take priority when fighting Zeref. Does he become the demon E&D enveloped in anger, a dragon consumed by hate like Acton Logia, or simply choose to remain human? Natsu never had the power to kill Zeref. The only person that did was the one who loved him most. The person that wanted him to stay alive the most. And that would bring the irony full circle. He would only die when someone wanted him to live more than anything. Fairy Tail is often seen as unexceptional or worse, but it's an underrated example of how long-running narratives can continue building on top of itself. To summarize, the Tower of Heaven is about the value of life, Tenro is about obsession over the past, Grand Magic Games is about fear of the future, and Tartarus is about grief and mourning. I don't think I could nail down the Alvarez arc with one core theme, largely because it's so long it has the job of concluding the entire story and all the ideas we talked about. Horatio and Stace and Ellis are nice arcs too, but they're about redemption and colonization, respectively, which don't play into Zeref's character very much, which is why I didn't mention them until this point. But if you want to hear me talk more about Fairy Tail and those arcs, check out my side channel Evil Puff, there's a 2-hour video there for you. Special thanks to my good friend Shiki to proofreading the script and generally just giving me some ideas to work with. Thanks, buddy. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see ya in the next one.